we'll get started. Maybe we won't have as much to do as I anticipated based on the number of people who do or don't arrive. But this week we're kind of blending weeks, right, from reading for the course of 2 weeks on transnational feminist rhetoric or transnational feminism, and something that I'm calling crossing borders. And I use that term very expansively because I think that the articles that I included with Steve Parks and Ahmed Hachelef, as well as KJ Rawson, their articles are all about crossing borders, but they're different types of borders, right? There's geographic, there's institutional, there's gendered borders, all different ways of looking at it. I have to say this week a lot of the weeks are interesting because I personally know the people, but this week is particularly interesting because Eileen Schell was one of my professors. She was on my dissertation committee. I saw her this week at the conference. Steve Parks is one of my best friends, and Ahmed, I just saw him at the conference, and Steve. So I feel like I'm reading their stuff, but then I'm also, teaching their work, which is kind of strange. And then KJ Rawson, I actually was just emailing with KJ today. So there's a lot of cool overlaps, but also it shows you it's not like I'm some famous person. That's just how small the field is. Like once you get connected with, with a certain field, it's very insulated. So it's easy to kind of get stuck in that. But then it's also really nice because you actually get to participate in these conversations. So the people who were reading, I see them at conferences, and it's very much like you talk to them, and you get to share your ideas with them. So that's kind of cool, where I don't think as grad students you always, at least I didn't always realize that. It seemed like that world is out there and I'm not part of it. But then the more you participate in it, it really is it's a small little world of academia, if you want to be part of it. So I'll just go over a couple things. We're actually going to do a lot of listening today. And I don't know if anyone has trouble with listening, but I do have the transcripts of, I think, everything that we're listening to, so I'll pull those up. And then I did upload this Google document to our drive already, so that if you need to on your own computers look at the transcripts, that you can do that, okay? Because we have a podcast we're going to listen to, and then depending on if I decide to do it or not, we'll have a video article to listen to. But I want to start out with configurations of transnationality, and this is by Wendy Hesford and Eileen Schell. These are two powerhouse authors. These are just a couple of their books that they've written. And just, I want to take a look at the titles, for instance. So we have Gypsy Academics and Mother Teachers, Gender, Contingent Labor, and Writing Instruction by Eileen Schell. Reclaiming the Rural, Essays on Literacy, Rhetoric, and Pedagogy. Rhetorica in Motion, Feminist Rhetorical Methods and Methodologies. Spectacular Rhetorics, Human Rights Visions, Recognitions, Feminisms, Precarious Rhetorics, and then Just Advocacy, Women's Human Rights, Transnational Feminisms, and the Politics of Representation. So just hearing those titles and seeing those titles, what are you thinking? What comes to mind? What kind of scholarship do you think these women do? How would you describe it, just by thinking about key terms that you're seeing?
I would say maybe the struggle of women to be active in the field of composition, which might have predominantly been a male-dominant field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, so Rhetorica in Motion is actually kind of a play on that, because normally when you think of rhetoric, it often gets framed as Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, and all the white men who taught us rhetoric, right? And Rhetorica in Motion is kind of taking that up as a feminist methodology and bringing women into the discussion. Women and non-white bodies, pretty much. So thinking about that, what else do you notice about these titles?
I think a lot of them contain some type of movement. You've got titles like reclaiming and representation and motion, spectacular rhetorics. These types of things symbolize some type of movement, whether it be a movement like a group of people in a movement or a movement of change, from one place to another, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that comes up a lot this week, it comes up a lot throughout this course, which is not the case in all of composition and rhetoric, but it comes up a lot through our course that the text that we're reading, and especially what these two are writing, have to do with usually social movements for justice, social justice in some way, and then also how do we act on that? Wendy Hesford does a lot of visual rhetoric. How do we analyze images? But then, as you saw from the readings this week, a lot of it is also how do we analyze documents that shape our lives, public policies? How do we analyze things that are happening in our life to then do something about it, to maybe change gender inequality? So that's just kind of, I think, a real big theme throughout their work. We have a presentation. Is Abigail here? I don't think so. Abigail's presentation, I'm just going to move through it a bit before we actually are going to listen to Rebecca Dingo. Okay, so Rebecca Dingo, it's Linking Transnational Logics, a feminist rhetorical analysis of public policy networks. And oh wait, not Abigail, sorry, Sherilyn. Okay, so I'm going to click through these slides a bit. Now we're good. Introduction, configurations of transnationality, locating feminist rhetorics. All right, so we have some keywords here. Intercultural communication, which is communication between people from two different cultures. Feminism, advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. Rhetoric, effective of persuasive speaking or writing. Rhetorical criticism, an analysis of symbolic artifacts of discourse, post-colonial literature, literary writings that react to the discourse of colonization, and then transnational feminism, both a contemporary feminist paradigm and the corresponding activist movement concerning how globalization and capitalism affect people across nations, races, genders, classes, and sexualities. So those are some really important key terms. Abigail says the summary is here. Using borderlands. Has anyone read that? Borderlands. Oh my gosh. All right, read that. Using borderlands as an example, transnational authors and texts and post-colonial authors and texts in this instance are branded so because of their cultural makeup, thereby instituting a stereotype, hurting through helping. The rhetorical field creates ironies in the process of accepting figures, institutionalizing certain forms of resistance, romanticizing mobility and hybrid identities, torturing individual writers over and above contextual and geopolitical analysis of alternative rhetorical practices. There's some examples here of kind of where literature is coming from. Obviously, here we have post-colonial literature from India, post-colonial literature in English, and then other languages. And then here's I think, a map of rhetorical practices. So I just wanted to give us that framework really quickly as we look at and listen to a couple things. First of all, unfortunately, you get more of my voice. I do apologize. But then you'll also get Rebecca Dingo in here. And I'm going to stop the podcast after Rebecca Dingo. If you need a transcription, go to this website. It's linked on my, it should be linked from this image right here. It's called This Rhetorical Life. And then the transcript, I'll pull it up here, but it's right here. And so what this podcast is from, I think it's from 2013. In Syracuse University, where I was in grad school, we held a conference or kind of a symposium And we brought in Rebecca Dingo, and then we also had Anna Hensley, and then Tim Doherty. You'll recognize his work. Eileen Schell was there, and Donna Olwan. And we brought them all together. Everyone was at Syracuse except Rebecca Dingo. We invited her to come be the keynote speaker. And they all talked about what transnational feminism meant. It's a great podcast overall, I think. But we're only going to listen to kind of the beginning framing, Rebecca Dingo's, maybe Anna Hensley's, and then Eileen Schell's, because they're kind of smaller moments. The whole thing is less than an hour, but we're going to listen to just part of that. But I want you to be thinking about this, because Rebecca Dingo, well, first you're going to get me speaking, and what I'm doing in the beginning is framing what transnational feminism is, okay? And I'm pulling this not from my own knowledge, but I'm pulling it from Wendy Hesford and Eileen Schell's work. I'm pulling it from ideas of feminism and rhetorics as part of the discipline, and framing kind of who these keynote speakers are. Then we actually get Rebecca Dingo talking, and she's talking about her book, Networking Arguments, as well as this article that created the book. This was really the one of the key articles from the book. So you should kind of recognize what she's talking about. But she's also thinking about this a little bit more broadly, and kind of trying to ask people, like, how do we take up this method or methodology of transnational feminism? Okay, so that's what I want you to listen for. It'll be about maybe 12 minutes at most right now. I might stop it in between, but that's what we're going to listen to, okay? Does anyone have questions before we start? Okay.
You're listening to This Rhetorical Life, a podcast dedicated to the practice, pedagogy, and public circulation of rhetoric in our lives. The interviews we have are always special, but this week's episode is a particularly special event. On March 22nd, the Composition and Cultural Rhetoric Graduate Circle, a group of PhD students here at Syracuse, hosted our first live-recorded podcast event, Feminist Perspectives on Living a Rhetorical Life in a Transnational World. Jess Pauschek, a first-year CCR student, offers a more thorough introduction of the meaning, purposes, and goals of this theme.
In this podcast initiative, we think of the phrase rhetorical life to include all the daily and scholarly means of persuasion. Our podcast theme today, Feminist Perspectives on Living a Rhetorical Life in a Transnational World, sprang from the emergence and growth of transnational feminist work in the field of rhetoric and composition. But this work has been highlighted through various platforms. In 2008, College English, the special issue, was on feminist transnational research. At the biennial Feminisms and Rhetorics Conference, this year called Rhetorics, Feminisms, and Global Communities, and by key scholars like Rebecca Dingo, Eileen Schell, Wendy Hesford, and others. So in rhetorical studies, feminist scholars are taking up transnational work by examining such issues as international policies and arguments, pedagogies and classroom writing assignments, and methodologies for rhetorical genealogy, archival work, and engagement with communities. Beyond our own field, though, women's and gender studies scholars have been engaging with transnational feminist work for even longer. This research has taken up transnational feminism through seeking to understand social movement, solidarity building, critiquing international politics as gendered activities, and examining women's lives, experiences, and histories as cross-cultural struggles. In both of these fields of study, transnational feminism seeks to understand how complex networks of linguistic, economic, geographical, political, and cultural factors flow across local, national, and international borders, affecting real people and real communities. So this podcast event today is an effort to engage with some of these interdisciplinary conversations. Our panel aims to join the multiple perspectives in order to engage in a feminist dialogue about where we can go next with our teaching, our research, and our daily lives. To be sure, this panel promises to present diverse and even perhaps contradictory views and implications for feminist transnational approaches. But at the foundation of this discussion is the acknowledgement in transnational feminist work that borders are porous and extend beyond the United States, and that our work should move past US-centric and Western world narratives. Transnational feminism moves beyond internationalization and globalization, and beyond comparative and contrastive rhetorics that place Western traditions at the center while deeming rhetorics of other nations as the periphery. Instead, we seek to understand the interactions and intersections among geographic, economic, social, linguistic structures, as well as cultural ideologies. To do this, we must rethink what it means to be transnational, how movements of text, knowledges, and people happen across and beyond borders of nation states, and how we as scholars and citizens can act rhetorically in a transnational world. So for this discussion, we've asked our panelists to talk about how they engage rhetorically as feminists in their work and day-to-day lives. From a feminist perspective, what does it mean to live a rhetorical life in a globalized world? Why is a feminist perspective productive for 2013? What are important sites and lived spaces in which we need to be rhetorical? How do you bring a feminist perspective that highlights a transnational world into your teaching, your administrative duties, your service work, your field commitments, personal life, and your activism? How do you locate transnational issues and sites that are important? And finally, how do you enact a feminist transnational method? These questions are only a starting point, and we know that each panelist will take them up in varying, insightful, and productive ways. So let us continue the conversation as we seek to make meaning in a transnational world and construct new spaces of agency as feminists within this rhetorical life.
All right, really quick. So before we hear Rebecca Dingo, I could teach a whole class on transnational feminism, all right? But we're doing this as 1 week within our broader class of what it means to compose in a globalized world, right? So let's talk it out a little bit. What do you notice as the similarities or kind of moments of interaction with what Wendy Hesford and Eileen Schell, maybe that I'm saying, and then Rebecca Dingo, Mary Queen? What do you notice as links between this idea of transnational feminism and our class composing in a globalized world? Like, how do they intersect? Can you talk a little louder?
Yeah, the idea where you said like not only what you're doing in your research, but in the field, in live, and how that all, in every category that we talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So that our work is kind of intersectional across those borders, right?
And so like, whether it's in linguistics or English in the classroom or whatever, there's more to be done than just to write.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I think, well, I'll talk after. Yeah. What else?
I think also, like you mentioned, you said the borders were very porous. And that makes me think of, I think it was Mary Queen's article about women like using the internet to connect with a much larger audience where international boundaries didn't really matter as much.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing the speakers in the classroom. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I didn't catch some of that.
Okay, we'll try and speak up a little louder. I think this is the microphone, right? Yeah, so you might have to kind of yell at it or come up here maybe.
Could I speak on it for just a minute? Or a couple of...
Yeah.
Okay, I think what it's really, it seems like a call to action that, women, and especially those that have the feminist perspective, need to speak out and be heard, just like our LEP students, just like our African American students, just like other students, and that they're an important people group that needs to be heard and needs to be maybe speaking on, what moves them rhetorically speaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like the
And speak a little louder.
And again, this is implying I have a rough handle on what neoliberalism means. If I understand it correctly, it's we keep the structures in place, but we change who's in them. Is that kind of an oversimplification?
Say more.
Like if you wanted a neoliberal approach to capitalism, you might take all the business CEOs and replace who they are with other people for representation, but you would leave that corporate structure intact.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't burn it down, you would repopulate it with different people.
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism comes from the idea of like everything being privatized. How many, how many of you feel like you don't have a grasp of neoliberalism?
Don't.
Don't.
Okay, I said you do. It's like.
All right, let's let me go off track for a second. There's a good, obviously so neoliberalism. This one's pretty good. Neoliberalism. I'm not an economist, right? But I write a lot about neoliberalism in the sense of the time period I'm interested in with my working class archive, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, is really under the Thatcher era. And so Reagan and Thatcher were really notable kind of proponents of neoliberalism because they wanted to privatize services. So for instance, by privatizing education, by privatizing healthcare, by privatizing those things, you gain control, corporations gain control of people's bodies, people's health, people's education, all of those things. So neoliberalism is this idea of kind of how corporations control the privatization of goods and services. That's very quickly. This is I mean, for a 3-minute video, it's decent. We'll go ahead and watch it.
Isms, neoliberalism. Friedrich Hayek, a Tweedy Austrian-born economist, had one of those light bulb moments in the mid-1930s and switched on an ideology that unites its enemies in scorn, that has inspired governments and entrepreneurs down the decades: neoliberalism. The idea was built on the classical liberalism of the 18th century and a defense of individual liberty, protecting private property and the freedom of markets from external interference, taxes, regulations, levies, as much as possible. Neoliberalism argued that the market wasn't just an absence of interference, it could produce a philosophy or a way of thinking all of its own. That meant looking at the world and at transactions in daily life through the eyes of the market. You can glimpse this, for instance, when I say, I'm in the market for a beer, showing that we've internalized the idea of a market for other values. Nowadays, you probably hear the word neoliberalism used more as a term of abuse, hurled by opponents at economic globalizers, nasty bankers, or governments limiting spending on public works or welfare. The word neo or new has morphed into a way of signalling, I don't like this one bit. It's the nearest thing economic terminology has to a rotten tomato. But neoliberalism isn't just a dirty word, it's an entire mindset of approaches to the way state and market interact with our aspirations, emphasizing privatization over state control as the best way to deliver public services. The advent of neoliberalism led to one of the great punch-ups of economists, between Hayek and his best frenemy, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that government should get involved in increasing demand to keep productivity up and unemployment down. Hayek dismissed Keynes as knowing very little about economics, and he wrote a snotty book review of one of Keynes's major works. Despite their bickering, though, their competing ideas, Keynesianism and neoliberalism, remain the seesaw of big thinking in practical economics. Keynesianism won for a good while after World War II, but by the end of the 1970s, public sector strikes and worries about stagflation, an ugly combo of stagnation and inflation, persuaded some mold breakers to look back to neoliberalism as a way to perk up flagging economies. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher led the way in embracing the notion, and so did a ruthless dictator, Auguste Pinochet in Chile, which rather marked down the democratic scorecard of neoliberalism. The financial crash of 2007-8 created a more testy mood towards deregulation, and neoliberalism gained a bad rep because it was taxpayers who had to bail out the banks. But there's a broader cultural reason neoliberalism gets it in the neck right now. Inevitably, it leads to such fast-paced, uncontrolled globalization because it does away with barriers to trade and to financial flows. It prizes the innovative above continuities, so you could say it puts the corporation above the nation. But the globalized world we inhabit, one of startups, the ability to move money and borrow cheaply, and companies operating across borders, owes a lot to the Austrian Friedrich Hayek and his light bulb moment.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive
So to give you an example, in my research, for instance, the way that Margaret Thatcher and neoliberalism gets kind of portrayed through her is that during the late 1970s and the 1980s, what was happening in England is there was rapid deindustrialization, same thing as the US, right? A lot of factories are closing. In England, the mining industry is just completely demolished, pretty much. And it was all of this idea of like, well, Margaret Thatcher is famously known as saying, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals, and only individuals can kind of do good for themselves, pretty much. But she says there's no such thing as society. So there's individuals and they kind of work their way up or don't, right? And what was happening is like, for instance, housing became privatized. So governmental housing, or they called it council housing, all of a sudden, they started regulating it to the point where, like, okay, say Brian, you have some council housing. So in the 1970s, that was very common for working class people. Like everyone in this room, you're working class, you live in council housing in 1970s England, okay? All right, 1980s comes around, we like neoliberalism. You can live in that housing as long as you can buy it. And to buy it, we're going to price you out of it, okay? Working class people can't buy it. But we're going to regulate it through privatized services. The government won't do it, or we'll privatize it. So what happens to you all if you can't afford that?
Yes.
You're out, right? So all of a sudden, what was once a kind of governmental, like social good becomes privatized, and then the people who actually should benefit from it can't afford it and they're kicked out of it. And so that's kind of one example of what happened in England with council housing. Is I know people to this day who said, like, talk about being kicked out of council housing because it was privatized. So like that's one example of how neoliberalism is kind of enacted in everyday life, but it's so much more extensive than that.
Is it the same strain that we hear every time? It's less popular than it used to be, but 10, 15 years ago, privatizing Social Security?
A bit.
Same attitude.
Yeah, some of it. I mean, to think of it this way, so neoliberalism is connected to the GRE and the SAT. Why? Because all of a sudden, education, you have to buy a test, you have to pay to be tested, and that testing money goes to a corporation that is not part of the government. It's not part of our like American citizenship at all, but it's an SAT company that gains money and advantage off of profiting from us taking tests. Every single student in America taking tests. That's kind of an example of something being privatized and based on a corporation and the capital that that corporation gets, as opposed to like a public good. Does that kind of make sense? I'm not an economist.
The
I don't.
argument against net neutrality was not to regulate it like a public service, because that would move it into a different category, so regulations would apply to it differently. So lobbying against treating it like a service, like a phone line or like a cable line, keeping it separate from that allows corporations to control it more closely, so that would be neoliberal.
Probably. I don't know enough about net neutrality discussion to say that, but based on what you're saying, think of it this way. Based on our class, who benefits if corporations run everything? Corporations. Who is our class kind of talking about? Like this class, what have we been reading?
Loosely, workers.
Workers, immigrant writing, teachers, marginalized communities. They are not the ones benefiting from corporations getting money, right? So neoliberalism kind of very, very loosely, again, I'm not an economist, but it pits kind of capitalism versus, you know, like working people, pretty much. I'll have some more examples because we're actually going to read some of the texts from my work in a couple weeks. So I'll give you some more examples specifically geared toward that. We'll also actually, I'll have us listen to Anna's, I think Anna will be a good example of neoliberalism, but you'll also get it from Rebecca Dingo's talk here, so we can chat about it more. But so Hesford and Shell, really quick before we go into Rebecca Dingo's, I want to bring up a couple things that they say. So they're focused on transnationality, feminist rhetorics, and transnationalism. And they say this special issue on feminist rhetorics and transnationalism challenges the disciplinary defining of rhetoric and composition around U.S.-centric narratives of nation, nationalism, and citizenship, including its focus on feminist and women's rhetorics only within the borders of the U.S. or Western Europe, and explores its potential complicity in reproducing institutional hierarchies. So that goes in with the theme of this class, right? We're kind of decentering narratives of like, well, English-only policies and composition happens only in the U.S. I'm trying to give you a broader glimpse of that. Unfortunately, and I admit this is a limit of this class, is we only read stuff basically in English, right? We have little moments of Spanish or other languages in the articles, but that's a limit of teaching a transnational topic. Is if everyone in the room is largely monolingual, you can't really teach multiple languages, right? So we have to, that's a limit of it. Another limit is, I think I told you all this, but composition and rhetoric as a field is very, very largely American based. I would say in the years that this was 2008, I would say that it has expanded a little bit more. People like Suresh Kanagaraja are writing about Sri Lanka. People like Steve Parks and Ahmed Hachelef are writing about Algeria, and Steve's work is actually based in Syria as well. So there's people talking about other nations and including other nations, but it's still very much an American discipline in a lot of ways. So what else Hesford and Shell say here is that transnationality refers to the movement of people, goods, and ideas across national borders. Like the term borderland, it is often used to highlight forms of cultural hybridity and intertextuality. To bring a transnational focus to our field will require new methodologies and critical comparativist perspectives, which in turn may shift the objects and areas of study. However, our goal is not to compare cultural or national differences as if they were discrete entities, but to focus on how different cultures are transformed by their contact and interaction with each other. So to give you an example of this, and we'll talk about it either at the end of class today or definitely next week when we talk about our proposals, but transnationalism is not what do we do in the US and how do we teach writing in China. It's not how do we teach English here and how do we teach it in Sri Lanka. It's figuring out what they're saying here, how different cultures are transformed by their contact and interaction with another. So how does teaching in Sri Lanka impact teaching in the US, or how do they merge or how do they shape it? So Minzon Liu's work is really important in that way, where she talks about how, you know, people in Asian countries are getting their tongue surgically cut so that they can speak English, quote unquote, better, right? That's how English is interacting in a country, but it's not comparing Asia and America. It's not comparing the two. Does that make sense?
So to take that and apply like feminism to it, you would not take the American notion of feminism and moving towards voting rights, right? And the logical progression of what happened and apply that to another country, either as the model or as what they should do or the way they should. Okay.
Because then you're taking an American-based first world, very much capitalist system and applying it to countries that are not, most of which are not first world. They don't have the same human rights about women. And they don't have the same type of government, right? Democracy. And think about capitalism the same way, right? So how would a methodology, a feminist methodology here, be applied to those countries that they don't fit into the same context? It's absolutely right. So this kind of goes back to Kate Vieira and Rebecca Lorimer Leonard and Morris Young's definition, where they're like, you don't study something out there and bring it in the US. It's more or less of that. I like to think of like those moments of tension or like those moments of collision. Like, where are these moments intersecting and how are they kind of brushing up against each other? Where are they intertwining? But it's not a compare and contrast. Okay? So that's what I want a couple people to think about with their papers is we're not comparing and contrasting. Okay? It's difficult. So let's go ahead and listen to Rebecca Dingo's. And as I said, her discussion is about her article and her book, but then a little bit more broadly about her work on transnational feminism. Okay?
We invited a range of diverse speakers with different areas and levels of expertise on transnational feminism and rhetorical studies. First, you'll hear from featured speaker Rebecca Dingo.
Saying insightful and productive ways. So,
or local circumstances.
Anna Hensley, an ABD doctoral fellow, and Tim Doherty, a third-year doctoral student. The respondent for the discussion is Eileen Schell, associate professor of writing and rhetoric at Syracuse. First up is Rebecca Dingo.
To lead a rhetorical life in a globalized world for me is to always explore beyond what appears on the surface of discourse as normal and everyday face value, to look past isolated moments of rhetorical persuasion, the dynamic cultural, political, and economic powers present that are not so obviously present in a given moment. And it is within the recognition and analysis of how these forces intersect that I am compelled to act. This approach may sound somewhat obvious, but this sort of work is oftentimes common in the field of feminist rhetorical studies, which so often focuses on individual women's rhetorical acts within a specific moment of time. Rather than focusing on an isolated moment or action, a transnational feminist model emphasizes that the category of woman, or indeed her words, are entangled within a variety of connections. To understand women's oppression, I consider not only specific speech acts or local circumstances, but how that specific speech act and local circumstance relate to and are informed by context of the current moment, supranational policies, colonial history, global economic structures, and very complicated power relationships between one-third and two-thirds worlds. Following Sherry Stone Matador, I situate language practices within far-reaching political and economic systems. Ultimately, deep, meaningful rhetorical work then requires recognizing the centrality of gender, race, sexuality, ability, and geopolitics, and understanding the spoken, written, and resulting of material effects of discourse. So living a rhetorical life for me means constantly recultivating a transnational literacy. At its basic definition, literacy includes reading and writing practices that are used to interpret and evaluate knowledge. Yet, as Deborah Brandt points out, literacy can be a powerful, quote, economic, political, intellectual, and spiritual resource, unquote, that offers new ways of understanding our world. As such, as Kim Donhauer, Charlotte Hogue, and Eileen Schell point out, literacy practices must promote thinking and writing about and acting upon the complex interrelated economic, social, political, and cultural systems that create inequalities. For transnational feminists and cultural studies scholars, literacy additionally means considering effective economies, which is part of the study of my next book, and how cultural systems have schooled how we receive, react to, process, understand, and then act upon that information. What I mean by transnational literacy then is cultivating reading and pedagogical practices And in this case, I mean both pedagogy and within the classroom, and then within more broader sense of what Raymond Williams has described as permanent education, that advances literate understandings of how we fit into complicated and overlapping global systems and ideologies. Transnational literacy is a way of reading and actively responding to the complex networks where rhetorics travel and are deployed, as well as to the external social, economic, and geopolitical influences that serve as exigencies. Let me offer you a few brief examples. As I began in my book, Networking Arguments, if as rhetoricians we take at face value Hillary Clinton's call to empower and mainstream women into policy affairs at the 1995 Beijing Conference on Women, then we might assume that her call to empower women and her recognition of women's poverty across the globe ended up having very positive results for those very women. As my work shows, however, unless we unpack and explore the pretexts of her words and then follow the material work of her words, we might not have learned how other policymakers picked up that very rhetoric of mainstreaming and empowerment to create policies imbued with neoliberal notions of personal responsibility and neocolonial notions of the backward and helpless so-called third world woman at the expense of recognizing structural violence. For example, structural adjustment policies, economic migration, environmental degradation, colonial history, and political and cultural economies, to just name a few. Additionally, in the last few years, I've become a bit obsessed with what I've come to call armchair activism, which is also part of the study of my next book, which I see arising out of what Wendy Brown has called neoliberal governmentality, where wealthy and mostly US citizens are asked to participate from afar in ending some sort of oppression in the so-called developing world. And oftentimes this takes place through social media. Some examples you might have heard include the Half the Sky movement, the Girl Effect, Stones to Schools, Kiva, Coney 2012, and Tom's Shoes. These examples demonstrate to me the need to develop a transnational literacy that firstly seeks to identify the collective affects and structures of feeling present in the 21st century that impel citizens to participate in anti-oppression movements, in order to secondly offer new reading and writing pedagogies or transnational literacy practices that work to reorient, as Sarah Ahmed calls it, these common narratives away from a politics of pity and monetary exchange, and instead connect them to the historical yet ever-present geopolitical and local structures that constrain women's agency. This literacy project seeks not only to lay bare the structural violence that is hidden, but it also seeks to lay bare the effective economies that keep structural violence hidden. These examples demonstrate the connection between language, the circulation of text, knowledge, ways of knowing and feeling, and resources in a globalized political economy. But more importantly, they demonstrate that traditional forms of rhetorical analysis, ones that maintain static notions of speaker, audience, and context, can no longer contain all the influences at play within a rhetorical exchange. Therefore, as a practicing rhetorician, I often consider how to do ethical feminist work as a 21st century feminist rhetorician. What does this approach look like? What kind of literacies do I need as a scholar before I act? And do I need as an activist before I act? What do I need to understand about the context that shape people's lives in a globalized world? Let me end by attempting to show this approach by quickly drawing on a common touch point many of us shared recently, the Four Cs in Las Vegas last week. If we are talking about the feminist practice of networking and reading connections between things that might not appear to be connected transnationally, we can, of course, look at how texts circulate, as I do. But we also can look at how locations and spaces are continually rhetorically constructed through transnational power relationships. For example, in Las Vegas, we see the legalization of sex work by the state, and then that this is advertised along corners all along the Strip by laboring mostly of color and possibly immigrant men standing on street corners wearing shirts that advertise the ability to order women within 20 minutes, much like food delivery, and handing out photos of topless women. The state supposedly manages sex work, so sex work is public. Yet, as Elizabeth Bernstein and Alison Brisk each have noted, sexual exploitation happens both out in the open through structural violence, through like images and everyday practices, and in the private, and domestic works in homes, in hotels, in sweatshops, on farms, in state-sanctioned prostitution activities. State-sanctioned rhetoric can hide the various violences that circulate under the radar of the so-called safety of the state. In Las Vegas, where the display of women's bodies for consumption is normalized, transnational feminism shows us how the normative display of women's bodies as objects is linked to a larger continuum of gendered violence, with material results such as the Steubenville case. Transnational feminism can link how the status of women as objects of casual staring makes it easier to exploit them and their labor. This exploitation of labor is especially true for immigrant or migrant women who are shaped by a transnational political economy and who are drawn to Vegas for work in the service industry. Ultimately, developing a transnational feminist literacy offers us nodes on the network where we can act, and it reveals to us the rhetorical and material structures we must take into account as we act and communicate and write. Thank you.
Okay, so that's Rebecca Dingo's talk. Okay. Really quick, I have too many things open. But one of the things I want to point back to is when she says here, neoliberal notions of personal responsibility and neo-colonial notions of backwards and helpless, so-called third woman. So this idea of personal responsibility, that's what I was saying with Margaret Thatcher, where she says there's no such thing as society, only individuals, and only individuals can help themselves. She's saying, don't rely on a public to help you. Don't rely on society to help you. Don't rely on the government to help you. It's your responsibility as citizens to do what you need to get where you need to go.
That bootstraps mentality.
Yes, very much so.
So it's that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely connected to that. So neoliberalism pits responsibility very much as it is your individual job to build yourself up, the bootstraps. In America, it'd be kind of the bootstraps, right? Okay, so we have Rebecca Dingo's talk, right? Have any of you ever thought, right, one of the things she says about armchair activism and how that kind of perpetuates these structures of thinking of, like, for instance, I love Tom's shoes, I'm not gonna lie, and I buy them. But does buying Tom's shoes change structural inequalities of people in the third world and people in America?
No.
Why not?
Because the businesses that are there, that they're giving, so the businesses that are there that actually sell shoes are losing money. So it just perpetuates, it hurts them. But the idea is, I'm humanitarian, I'm gonna help them, so I'll pitch in by helping myself with buying my shoes. Instead of giving money to a country that needs it, or instead of giving money to the community that I live in.
Mm-hmm. Or Rebecca Dingo might even go further and say, no, it's not actually about giving money, it's about trying to figure out how to help that community without the idea of money, right? But you're absolutely right. It's this idea of, and I'm not judging it because I participate all the time in it. I'm like, oh, someone's doing a fundraiser for the Phantom Bird, so I'm like, the Audubon, I'll donate to the Audubon. And maybe some of that does structurally change things, right? Maybe buying a pair of Tom's shoes does help someone in a third world country. But she's talking about the more explicit kind of structures that create inequality, and how that armchair activism of just like clicking a button, saying, you know, liking things, that doesn't really change anything. Doesn't mean you can't do it, doesn't mean I won't do it, but she wants us to think about those things, right? And so what her goal is when she's talking about particularly Hillary Clinton and the uptake of how policy, it's one thing to promote something, but it's another if people take that up, and one, if they take it up the way that you intended, and two, if they take it up and actually practice the thing that they're saying they're going to do. So do the policies after the Beijing conference on women, do those actually structurally change the environment for women? Do those policies change women's rights and make women's inequality, you know, more equal? That's kind of what Rebecca Dingo is looking at. Is not just how do we feel about this, but actually how did policies change or not change? And often we find out that they don't often change. So here's a little bit of a summary. Sherry Lynn wrote this. So while there's a big difference between first world and third world countries, when it comes to the economic policies of the World Bank and the U.S. welfare reform, they are similar because both seek to change the economy of women and their families by controlling and changing the actions of women. Dingo examines the rhetoric of both institutions with a feminist lens that shows how the U.S.'s welfare reform policies of the 1990s was based on persuading women to choose to get married, not have children out of wedlock, and work outside of the home. The World Bank's policies focused on persuading women in third world countries to contribute to their family's economy by entrepreneurship outside of the home. So we have the ideas of gender mainstreaming, neoliberalism again, networked global policy, neocolonialism, feminization, poverty. And then I won't read these, but these are some descriptions. I will read the gender mainstreaming. So it's a strategy to improve the quality of public policy, programs, and projects to ensure allocation of resources equitably among the sexes. So one of the things I thought about this week as I was reading Dingo's article and thinking of her work was one of my friends got a job recently, and I won't say where, but it's a Catholic university, and she likes it a lot, and all that, but she's kind of thinking, oh, what if I eventually want to have children? Is there maternity leave? Is there paternity leave? Like, what is there? And what she found out is she thought maybe because it's a religious-based institution that there might be some restrictions. So, for instance, like in terms of healthcare, they don't pay for birth control, right? In terms of maternity leave, there is not any, but you can file for something that puts you on like disability. Now, what is the issue with calling maternity leave part of a disability? There's a lot going on there, right? But it's this idea of kind of how we control women's bodies, or how we name it, how our policies enact these questions of, gender. And then also, obviously, there's issues with just how it's being framed as a disability, like giving birth, and being pitted as similar things, right? So something like that made me think of Rebecca Dingo's work and how I'm imagining a feminist transnational lens would kind of look at, okay, how did that change get made, and what are the rhetorics being used to move from someone having a baby to all of a sudden disability to all of a sudden not have, like, what are these moments of change, and how did those policies get enacted?
This isn't going to be elegant, but I'm not familiar enough with the shoes you're talking about. From what I've gathered, if it comes down to you buy a thing to donate to a cause,
yeah,
by buying and creating a market for the thing that might be mass produced overseas by the same structure that you're trying to combat maybe in another country, by buying this shoe, it kind of perpetuates the thing over here you're trying to fight over here.
Yeah, it's partly that, and then partly it's called one for one. So if you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, they also supposedly give a pair of Tom's shoes to someone in a third world country. Okay. Again, I'm not completely aware of the structures, and I think they actually have done a lot in the past couple of years to change the company a bit. But
the concept in general is what I was
absolutely
about, using and for an American to buy their way out of someone else's poverty, right? That's perpetuating the cycle here of consumerism.
Yeah.
So it's armchair is a pretty apt way to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I could sit at this computer and like donate to a bunch of stuff without ever moving.
Fixing everything.
Right? Yeah. Oh, I'm gonna cure cancer. Oh, breast cancer awareness. Okay, I'm gonna cure that. Okay. Oh, Tom's shoes gonna cure poverty. Right? Like, there's this idea of you can help by just sitting at your computer and clicking likes or donating money.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And again, I'm not judging that because I actually participate in some of that, but the idea of that is to think of the broader structures that are going on and what kind of that perpetuates and doesn't change, right? And how I think specifically too, because as I said, this class is very much, our composition is very much US based, that what we know about policies here won't always, and usually won't, apply to what policies are enacted in other countries. So it's one thing to say you're a feminist here, but feminism doesn't look the same across borders, and maybe like what you're doing here as a feminist, you can't just, it's not this thing you can just like kind of impart on everyone. Like I'm gonna go around and it's always gonna be the same because I'm the same.
Then it becomes colonialism.
Yeah. So we have this idea of, part in quotes, about gender mainstreaming. So we have this grand narrative of mainstreaming attempts to change women's behavior, shift their dependency from state to market, and ultimately to global capitalist economy, while heightening gender stratification by making women primarily responsible for their poor families. U.S. welfare policies and the World Bank's gender mainstreaming policies share a logic that suggests material inequalities can be overcome by managing women's actions. And then finally, as my interrogation of the World Bank and U.S. welfare policy shows, transnational situations that seem radically different and disconnected are actually bound by transnational networks, power, neoliberal logics, and similar rhetorical practices that function to define and contain women's agency in the global marketplace. All right. So we have some connections here. I won't read them all because this isn't my presentation. But I think this is kind of an interesting one. This idea of English, the language of business, can provide opportunities for those who learn to speak it. All right, that goes back to Catherine Prendergast and Conor Garage's idea of like how English being connected to a global economy all of a sudden shapes how the US has dominance, because we're primarily English speakers, and when we go into other countries, and if it's about business structures and capitalism, if you do need English to navigate those structures, all of a sudden it privileges certain groups of people who can speak standard English, right? And so I think that's how one of the ways in which transnational feminism kind of shows us a little bit more, right? So we've been talking a lot about language and how immigration and language politics affect composition, but this is a little bit more. It's hard to grasp in a lot of ways because I think you have to have a pretty strong understanding of global economics, which not many of us have, including myself. I've gotten there more so doing the research projects I have, but this is really kind of rooted in public policy and how do we kind of think through these structures. I am going to have us, because I think it'll be really, what's the word, tangible. I'm going to have us listen to Anna Hensley's, I wrote it down where it starts. I think hers will give kind of a practical example of how to take these things up, right? So I know that some of you in your blog posts or in your response papers are kind of saying, like, these texts are really hard, which I know that, right? But how do we take that up? And I think Anna, or Anna, I can't remember how she pronounces her name, but she takes that up. So we're going to listen to her talk. Again, it's less than 10 minutes long, so
I'm going to start in the abstract. My work starts with J. Dolmage's definition of rhetoric as, quote, the circulation of discourse through bodies. In the third octologue, Dolmage argued that studying any culture's attitudes and arguments about the body always connects us intimately with attitudes and arguments about rhetorical possibility. That is, to care about the body is to care about how we make meaning. In other words, looking at the way a culture talks about the body and looking at which kinds of bodies and embodiments a culture values indicates who is seen as a subject and who is granted the status of being a fit rhetor, of being someone assumed to have the agency to speak and to be heard. I think the definition of rhetoric as a circulation of discourse through bodies lends itself nicely to feminist work, given feminism's long history of concern with the varied and intersecting ways that bodies are marked, and with the way that these demarcations affect agency. But I think a transnational feminist lens calls us to remember that the way we talk about the body is neither static nor culturally contained, as it encourages us to recognize networks, to trace circulations of power, and to pay attention to relationships. Transnational feminism reminds us that bodies, including our own, exist in neoliberal, globalized economic frameworks where capital, ideology, and even bodies themselves are continually moving across borders, shifting in meaning, and having varied material effects as they circulate. To put it differently, a story about the body is never just a story about the body. It's always a story about a body in relation to others, and thus invokes a whole set of discourses and values that we need to be paying attention to.
I want to stop that really quickly. What are you thinking of in our class that connects to honest discussion so far?
I really like she had a sentence there that was I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember, something about their bodies being like not owned by the empire they're in, but being controlled by the empire. And I think a lot about, like, I'm connecting that with the way immigrants are almost forced to assimilate to our language. And our students as Ls are forced to adapt within so many years framework. They have to immediately know and be able to speak and write academically the language. And so it's whatever government body they're fit to. That's the connection I made. I thought that was a really powerful sentence that she had.
Absolutely. So we have this idea.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. What sentence are you looking at?
Maybe I didn't see it. No, it wasn't it. It was something else. She still had a powerful sentence there, but it wasn't the one I thought. Sorry.
But so the one that I was thinking of, but it goes to what you're saying. It's the idea of intersecting ways that bodies are marked and with the way these demarcations affect agency. So what does it mean that bodies are marked in Jay Dolmage's article as being labeled imbecile or moron or idiot, right? What does it mean if people are marked as non-native? What does it in Conagaraja's writing? What does it mean in Min Sun Lu's writing if people are marked as, you know, in some way being unfit or unable, right? And so that's kind of what all of these scholars are talking about. Anna's bringing this up really clearly, like with how we're marked by bodies, right?
I don't think it has to be quite so overt. I mean, these are because we're reading, but
yeah.
The thing I thought of was if you've ever seen when they take the hair dye commercial and they take the same blonde white girl and just overdub that in Spanish. They don't make any effort to change the body being depicted.
Yeah.
So it's sending the message that in this culture, this is the ideal, whether or not it's possible for you to attain. And the little bit of effort they go to make sure you buy the product is that you understand what it is and when you get it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is she's saying that networks, as it encourages us to recognize networks, to trace circulations of power, and to pay attention to relationships, transnational feminism reminds us that bodies, including our own bodies, exist in neoliberal globalized economic framework where capital, ideology, and even bodies themselves are continually moving across borders, shifting in meaning, and having varied material effects as they circulate. And I think this is an important sentence to think about as we maybe today or maybe next week talk about KJ Rawson's work and this idea of transgender being a term that is kind of shifting, right? And then just to go down, it says a story about a body is never just a story about a body. And I would say you can kind of substitute that sentence with a lot of things. A story about language is never just a story about language. We know it connects to power. We know it connects to class. We know it connects to power structures and white supremacy, right? So I think this kind of gives us a thread for what we've been talking about the whole semester, all right?
It reminds us that stories about the body have always played a powerful role in empire, outlining parts for various actors to play in dividing the world into clean categories: civilized and uncivilized, moral and immoral, masculine and effeminate, colonizer and colonial subjects. Narratives about the body are powerful precisely because they're pedagogical. They teach us how to think about ourselves and our experiences. They teach us how to orient ourselves to one another. They teach us ways of treating other bodies, other people. They teach us our place, whether a place of privilege or subjugation, and they teach us our proper way of acting within that place. But the stories we tell about the body can also be tricky because they have a tendency to hide their motives and cover over their ideological foundation. And I believe that transnational feminism calls us to uncover and trace the circulation of ideology in the stories we tell about our bodies in order to highlight the logics of power at work in neoliberalism and empire. So I'm going to move to something more specific now. And I should say that this is an example that I picked because it popped up in my news feed yesterday, and I picked it precisely because it's not remarkable. It's just the kind of thing that's happening now. So starting May 1st, employees of CVS pharmacies will be asked to submit to the collection of their weight, BMI, and blood glucose levels if they are part of the company's health insurance plan. The company insists that the new program is voluntary. However, those who opt out of the new data collection will have a $50 fee added to their insurance bills every month, making the cost of opting out a $600 annual charge. CVS believes that their program is not far off from programs instituted by other companies that try to incentivize healthier practices. I would argue that CVS is woefully fuzzy on the distinction between an incentive and a punishment. More disturbing is the fact that there's been no word yet on how the data collected from the employee health profiles will be used, but it seems very likely that this information could serve as the basis for assessing employees' higher premiums based on their weight. The new CVS program is rooted, of course, in ongoing discourses about the obesity epidemic or the war on obesity. Here, you really have your choice of panic-inducing phrases. The discourses thrive on the construction of crisis because crisis and panic work powerfully as justifications for invasive measures that increase surveillance and discipline of the body. When someone criticizes CVS for compromising the privacy of its employees and coercing them into submitting to health profiles, a multitude of voices are quick to defend the measure by saying that the crisis is so great that something must be done no matter how drastic, no matter how invasive. But this story carries with it a couple of different lessons about the body at work that I want to focus on. First, there are very specific bodies being invoked by this program, even as CVS works to universalize the bodies of their employees. While there are, of course, people working in management positions who are on the CVS health plan, the majority of CVS employees are no doubt service workers being paid a minimum wage. And low-wage service sector jobs tend to be jobs where women and people of color are overrepresented. The story the CVS program tells us is that the employees affected by the new program, employees who are implicitly raced and gendered, somehow present a greater health threat, are in greater need of surveillance, and have less ground on which to resist the program. This is part of a much larger discourse scapegoating poor people for the state of health in the US. But there's also a larger discourse coming into play here about labor and productivity that, in the face of continuing anxieties about the state of the US economy and the position of the US in a global economy, argue that America is burdened with a fat, unproductive labor class that threatens our standing as a world power. We're taught to fear an overseas workforce that is not only cheaper, but more fit. And we're told that if we're deemed unfit to do our jobs, it's our fault if we lose them. If we want to restore the power of the US, we're told, we need to properly discipline our bodies to ensure that we're not only ready and able to work according to the demands of neoliberalism, but that we need to be ready to fight and defeat our enemies. This isn't just a story about companies saving money on healthcare. It's a story about the strength and the productivity of the American body working in service of the free market. But this isn't by any means the only example of a powerful story being told about the body right now in this moment, right? Recently, actress Michelle Williams appeared in Red Face in a photo spread for an Other magazine. Stop and frisk laws are on trial in New York City. Legislation recently proposed in Arizona would make it illegal for trans people to use a bathroom that doesn't match the sex designated on their birth certificates. So remember to bring that to the bathroom with you. Disabled Iraq war vet Thomas Young wrote a last letter to George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, blasting them for their roles in the Iraq war before deciding to end his life. And we have the juxtaposed coverage of high-profile rape cases like the recent Steubenville convictions with the coverage of gang rapes in India. And those are sort of mutually educating. We need to pay attention to ideologies, to linked logics of power that mutually construct bodies along multiple axes. Because the point is not to recuperate a single identity at a time, but to fight a larger logic of power acting on multiple bodies in multiple ways across multiple borders. And to that end, I want to close with a set of questions to ask as we confront these stories about the body. When is the body made visible, and when is it allowed to disappear? When is the body made hyper-visible, and when is it deliberately eclipsed? How is the body marked, and what kinds of values does this marking point to? What kinds of emotion do stories about the body invoke, and what kinds of actions are they meant to elicit? What groups or subject positions are being invoked explicitly or implicitly when we talk about the body? What does the story about one kind of body, or how does the story about one kind of body mutually construct other bodies in other places or in other subject positions? What is the lesson we're being taught through these stories? What's the didactic end game? And most importantly, how do we begin to create new stories and new vocabularies for talking about the body that resist a colonizing logic and find rhetorical possibility in difference?
All right, so what's your reaction to Anna's talk?
Hung up on that food thing because there's such an odd, you talked about the workers, the low wage workers, and then being stigmatized as their bodies being wrong, when all I kept thinking is the only way to eat on low income is to eat bad food. Like there's no other choice. Like if you want to eat the kind of, right, because BMI is your
body mass index.
It's your fat to body weight ratio. So if everything you're eating is on a dollar menu, it's gonna be high. Like there's no choice other than to eat that way unless you're spending beyond your means or pooling money or because accessible cheap food in America is bad for you across the board. So they're being doubly punished for it. They eat what they can based on what they're being paid, and then they're being charged a surcharge for eating what they can afford.
Yeah.
Because of what they're being paid.
Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up too is like this idea of how interconnected, right? So she's talking about from a feminist perspective, specifically CVS workers. And she's not saying all CVS workers are women, but she is saying that many CVS workers would be categorized as, if you're working a service industry job, usually you are not kind of middle or upper class, right? You're working class because you need a service industry job, right? Many of those people who take service industry jobs are largely women and largely non-white people, specifically immigrants. And so thinking about that, and then also thinking about, so we have class, we have food, we have race, we have maybe a little bit of nationality, all kind of combined in this moment to say, here are all the systemic factors that are coming into this discussion, right? It's not just CVS is out to, try and make us healthy, but that it's an interconnected issue that has to do with kind of these ideologies that happen beyond CVS even, right? And I like what she's saying about, she has a moment where she talks about being fit Americans, and it made me think of the Ford article, right? Like this idea of who can do the work. The whole reason that Ford tried to Americanize their workforce was because they were worried about communism. They were worried about like Eastern European immigrants coming over here and being communists and socialists, and that all of a sudden they were gonna like take over the country. So we thought if we could Americanize them, hopefully we wouldn't have that many problems, right? And so it was like this idea to purify people in some way and to Americanize them. And it seems in the same way of like this idea of CVS of, all right, we're gonna make you more fit because we're getting you healthy, and then we're going to do this. It's really weird idea of corporations kind of ruling what you do with your body, right?
We get those here. We get those emails about when the health insurance comes up for renewal, that if you have a well check, if you go get a physical and can like prove in some form or fashion that you're healthy. But there's a way a corporation could do that, provide a gym membership, right? That's a reward versus a punishment as a fine. Like, either check this box or pay us more money versus here's something we can provide that might help you along the way.
Absolutely. Because I don't think anyone would argue with like, oh, people want to live healthy, would like to live healthy, right? I mean, generally speaking, people would like to be healthy and like live longer, generally speaking. But how people do that, is it because a corporation is fining you, or is it because they're like providing you resources? Right? It's kind of, it goes back to what many of you have talked about as instructors as like an asset or deficit based model, right? Like, do you look at your students from the deficit angle, or do you look at like what assets does everyone bring to the classroom, right? And how you frame that is very different. Yeah, Jacqueline.
Yes, that's an interesting point. And something else, if you could go back up a little bit, when she's talking about the colonized versus the colonizer, that reminded me of the article by Rebecca Dingo. And didn't it seem like the World Bank served in a way to colonize those countries that it's giving help to? Because it came and it gives this oversight and tells them, and in essence wants to fix what's wrong and dictates how to fix it, right? And it was just interesting, like how it was so different, the way they wanted to fix American women versus how they wanted to fix the women in those third world countries. And that was just, when I read that, it was so disturbing to me. Just because, I mean, I recognized it, that whole, like, women should, like, best served by staying home and taking care of their kids. I mean, I've been around that for years. My daughter went to schools where I was shamed for working. And the moms were like Harvard law graduates, and they ran the PTA and stuff like that. And if you worked, you were looked down upon, like, why aren't you taking care of your kids? But the third world countries, right, they were being told they had to leave their families and work. So, I found that really, it was disturbing to me, especially because from where I come from, Juarez, I saw that firsthand when that happened. When all those companies and those factories moved to Juarez, and they were recruiting women because they can pay women less. And, and they were recruiting women, and the requirement, and I would hear it on the radio, you had to finish middle school to get hired. And they hired thousands and thousands of women, and then they moved those factories to China, and all those women were left without work. So we can talk about stuff like CVS, but when we're talking about, like, in other countries what's happening, and those women, what on earth, like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely a very like real material example of how neoliberal logics kind of operate across borders, right? And across multiple borders. You're talking about not only coming from America, but then, moving one place and then moving another to China, right?
And then that, when it was starting to read about that post-industrialized thing, and I started to read a little bit about that, and it's like, oh, well, here in the US, we have to produce children that are going to be the ones that are going to create intellectual things. So of course they need a lot more, what they're talking about, these literacy sponsors, right? These sponsors that were going to provide all this crazy support to produce this one child that is going to do amazing things. But the kids in the third world countries, they're just going to fill the factories, so it's okay.
I think those are great points. So let's talk about Dingo's article for a little bit. What else, based on what Jacqueline's saying and maybe what Rebecca Dingo herself said and Anna Hensley, what else stands out to you about Rebecca Dingo's article? Yeah.
I was thinking during the audio recording and what Jacqueline was saying about the 1996 reform of welfare. And basically it becomes a penalty. The personal responsibility becomes a penalty. If you're not doing well, it's your own fault. It's because you're not trying hard enough. It's because you're not, whatever, fill in the blank, enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it too big a jump then to take that and currently now with the if you couldn't prove as an immigrant that you never needed any kind of public assistance, you were going to be bumped from having any type of green card or any type of, you had to prove you never needed, you were never a quote unquote drain on the system in order to qualify for something? Or is that a bridge too far to put those two things together?
I think they're connected. I don't exactly know what you're talking about, but it seems to be that they're connected in the way that you're describing them.
Absolutely, and I know exactly what you're talking about. That new policy says that they cannot have gotten any type of government assistance for 10 years while they were here if they ever want to become legal. And the other thing is, if you sponsor someone, even if they're in your family, you're financially responsible for them for 10 years. So if I sponsored somebody and like they come here and they work, but then let's say in year 5, they get cancer and they can't work anymore, I would be financially responsible for all of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's very much the no welfare stuff.
This is, in my head at least, along the same line as saying that because you might have had a child young and needed some assistance, well, that's your fault. You did the wrong thing, versus coming to a country where you don't have maybe language skills or access to, because we talk all the time about it, you know, you're a dentist in your home country and then you come here and your credentials are no longer recognized. So it is kind of the same attitude as criminalizing not having an income deemed, you know, good enough, and using any kind of assistance to get you where you would be able to make that is bad. It's your fault. You shouldn't have to do it. You can never have done it for X years if you want a status or something.
Yeah, that kind of limits who gets in, right? It's the filter of who we want to join here in the US, who can come through. They want extremely wealthy people that are well educated, that speak standard English, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were saying that, it made me, I was looking at Rebecca Dingo's article, and on page 493, she actually says, transnational networks symbolize the concentration of economic and political power of some countries and the limitations on others. So that idea of like how, you know, my question here was, why does Dingo use the metaphor of a network? And it's this idea of that the network concentrates power with some countries, but then the linked moments in that network, it also kind of puts limitations or removes power from other countries, usually third world countries, or the people who are not in power, right? And so I think that is one of the main reasons she's kind of talking about this moment of a network. Again, network as opposed to a compare and contrast kind of moment, right? Hesford and Shell say like that we're not talking comparative rhetoric. We're not arguing for or against. It's not this binary, but we're kind of thinking about how these pieces link together and how when you move people, as Jacqueline talked to us about, kind of as jobs move, how does that also impact kind of discussions of gender? How does that impact power relations? How does that impact monetary constraints, right? All of that is the movement of people and money and goods across borders kind of being connected. That makes sense? So what else do you get out of Rebecca Dingo's article? I know it's a difficult one. A couple of people emailed me and said it was difficult, but what do you take away from this article?
The idea that they didn't want to give women more, but just make them more responsible for their poor circumstances. And that was very bothersome because at first it seemed like they wanted to help women, and then all of a sudden that change came and they were like, no, never mind. It's your fault that you're in the state that you're in. And you're going to have to dig yourself out of it. And so, and then they proceeded to decide how they were going to be dug out on their terms. But the World Bank, I didn't even know about all this, but I looked it up. They have a lot of power. And in essence, the World Bank is in the U.S., right? Because the 7,000 out of the 10,000 jobs are in D.C. held by Americans. It's always an American that's the president of that bank.
Yeah. Do you have a particular moment that you're thinking about, or just in general?
Just in general, when I was looking this up, it's at it's on page 496 at the top, where it talks about the World Bank and a little bit and about the employees, and that was eye-opening, because how is that not kind of like colonizing other countries still?
Yeah, absolutely. So 496, all World Bank presidents have been U.S. citizens because the United States is the bank's largest monetary contributor.
Yes.
As well as what Jacqueline said, since Bretton Woods, the World Bank's headquarters has been in Washington, D.C., where 7,000 of their 10,000 employees live and work, right? And then later on, the bank's powerful liaison with the United States and its advisory relationships with developing countries can be seen as a form of neocolonialism. Although the bank makes clear that the countries it serves are members of its organization, there is an embedded set of power relationships present between the colonizer, the bank, and the colonized, developing countries, whereby the former tends to be technologically advanced and economically strong, and the latter tends to have little technological advancement and a simple and vulnerable economy. Absolutely. I think.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, and when they talk a little bit more down, how they exploit women because they know that women put their families ahead of their own well-being. What more can you say there? They deem their culture deficient, but then they exploit it.
So one of the things I have a question about is when you read stuff like this with Rebecca Dingo's work and Eileen Schell and Wendy Hesford's work, what do you see as kind of our role in this class? Like, what should we do with this? Do we just read it and then pass over it? Like, okay, this is a difficult article. I'm not involved in public policy. Like, what do we do with this?
I think recognizing how we're contributing to it and not really knowing.
So how do we, other than like just thinking a lot, how do we recognize how we're contributing to it?
I think it kind of goes back to the armchair activism. Like, yes, we can click a button on a screen and feel good about ourselves, but it's still perpetuating those disproportionate power systems.
Yeah, absolutely. What else?
Well, I've been doing a lot of feminist research along with this for another class, and many of the articles written on feminism are by women. They go really into feminism. They explain and they speak and they speak and they speak and they speak. And And I want to tell everyone here that identifies as a male, listen and read and understand that just because it's a woman speaking, it's beyond that, and maybe share that to other men that you interact with, because I can't tell you how many women I've read that are preaching over and over and over and over. This is what I see. This is what I see. This is what I see, and I think men, it goes in one ear and it goes out the other.
Yeah.
They might see that they understand it, but on day-to-day life, it's not recognizable.
Yeah.
As an effect that goes on.
So I wasn't planning on playing this, but I'm going to play like 2 minutes because, and you'll understand why, of Tim Doherty, right? So Tim Doherty is on this panel, and we read Tim Doherty's work, Knowing Your Story, right? But think of that question and listen to this.
Next up is Tim Doherty.
I stepped to this mic today with trepidation, not only because I'm humbled by the incredible work being done by the folks at this table, but also because I see a number of folks in this audience, many of them my anti-racist feminist mentors, who are infinitely more qualified to testify on this topic than me. But I also step with excitement, honored to join the long overdue and largely feminist-led transnational turn in rhetorical studies. As I do so, I'm trying to step with determination and perspective, seeking to work in alliance with Black and two-thirds world feminists like Joy James, who have long called the Academy to, quote, pivot the center of knowledge production, and have long led the way in transnational organizing to oppose all forms of oppression. But I step first with a story. Almost 12 years ago, not long after we fell in love, Tara and I took a weekend to go hang out with my parents. That first night after my mom went to bed, Tara and I got into a spirited discussion with my dad about politics, economics, future. And I was really energized by the exchange, and my dad and I continued to banter for a while after Tara went to bed. I felt like a proud peacock who'd performed well, both for my new partner and my parent alike. But when I joined Tara upstairs to say a quick goodnight, separate bedrooms for the unmarried in my Irish Catholic household, of course, I was shocked to learn that the conversation that so energized my dad and me had completely frustrated Tara. From her vantage point, she'd been merely a spectator to the argumentative posturing of two loud Doherty dudes. What I had experienced as a fun conversation, she'd experienced as an exhausting and futile effort to get a word in edgewise. And this gulf between our experiences of that very same moment, energized versus exhausted, authorized versus frustrated, these coupled with my utter obliviousness to her side of this shared story and became the first of many invitations in our relationship to check my male privilege, to trouble my all too easy whitely and male understanding of the goodness of my good intentions and my unreflexive attempts at rhetorical identification in the world. It's also become one of a number of cringeworthy experiential memories that I now carry in my body, memories wherein I have parroted the discourse or practices of white and or male supremacy. These memories of solidarity missed or epistemological violence wrought spur me these days to try to practice Krista Ratcliffe's rhetorical listening in order to make more conscious and accountable identifications across race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and nation in a world that is becoming increasingly connected, even as it becomes less and less habitable for more and more people under the centralizing accumulation dynamics of global capitalism.
So I think it brings up your point, like this idea of even Tim, who I will tell you, I know him, he was my office mate for a couple of years, is one of the sweetest, most genuinely good people I know. But even he's saying, like, there's these moments, and I think we all need to do this, like there's these moments where you still have to like think about who you are in position to who you're talking with, or who's completely not included because you're kind of in that space, right? So I know I wasn't planning on giving his talk, but you should definitely check out the rest of this podcast. It's really good. But I think it brings up your question of, or your kind of statement that like so many people doing feminist work are women, but men can be feminists too. Although it's problematic in recent months, Justin Trudeau famously kind of came out as saying he was a feminist, and of course it was like one of the first, I think it was like one of the first, world leaders to like openly advocate that he was male and feminist. Problems with Justin Trudeau lately. But absolutely, I think that brings up your point. Anything else? So talking about Hesford and Shell, Dingo, or Queen's article, do you have questions or comments on? Yeah.
I wasn't sure. I think I know what they mean, but I wasn't sure when. I think it was the Dingo article was saying 1/3 world versus 2/3 world.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like saying first world is actually smaller percentage?
Ish. I'll get back to you on that one because I don't want to explain it wrong. It's more complicated than I can explain right now. But yes, we'll get back to that.
To be continued.
To be continued. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. So let's do this. Let's take a couple-minute break, just like 4 or 5 minutes, and then we come back. Haley's not here anymore. Oh, is that a question, Robert? Oh, Haley's not here, but I have her recording on the Parks and Hichaliff article. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about Haley's presentation is on Steve Parks and Ahmed Hichaliff's article of Rights Without Guarantees, Friction at the Borders of Nations, Digital Spaces, and Classrooms. And it was really interesting this week for me to talk with Steve and Ahmed about the Twiza project, but also the different types of things that Ahmed has to go through. For instance, like even to get to the conference, he is supposed to have funding through school, and he had to like distort the title of his presentation so that people wouldn't, they looked at the proposal and they used Google Translate to see what he was presenting on, because most of the people there speak Arabic and French, and he was really worried, like if it got called like civic engagement or social justice, that he would be reprimanded and not be able to go. So the organizers of the conference actually just labeled it like, I forgot, it was something very neutral, like international writing, something like that, so that when his school administrators used Google Translate, they wouldn't prevent him from coming, because that's actually a very real concern that he has. For instance, he told us at the conference, he teaches this class and this English club, which you heard about in the article, where he sometimes rents movies through his university, and he talks about how like they started Google translating what he wants to see if it was okay. So like he asked for the movie Freedom Riders, and that was okay because like Freedom Riders doesn't really translate that well in French or Arabic, but like certain things he's been told no because of how it translates. Specifically, like they're worried about these very kind of leftist liberal ideas coming to Algeria. So that's Ahmed, but we have Haley's presentation now, so I'll go ahead and play it.
So I will be discussing of Rights Without Guarantees, Friction at the Borders of Nations, Digital Spaces, and Classrooms by Parks and Hichaliff. Got a lot to cover. So keywords that they use: community partnership, literacy, neoliberalism, critical pedagogy, transnationalism, decolonialism, and digital spaces. I also wanted to add that they really should have added justice, democracy, rights, and progress. So I did go ahead and define neoliberalism. It's the modified form of liberalism tending to favor free market capitalism. You have liberalism and capitalism there as well to make that definition even clearer. And then transnationalism, there's a YouTube video there for you to watch, but I really love the definition given to us by Bosch, a process by which migrants through their daily life activities create social fields that cross national boundaries. This is not assimilation. This is themselves in their new environment. And then last, decolonialism. We have seen this since the beginning of this class. So we see it in the introduction from English only and cross-language relations and composition. We see it in the Medina piece. We see it in pretty much all of Cushman's pieces that we have read. Pretty much they're saying that English only classrooms are not the future of English classrooms, and they never were. So I added the abstract because it simply tells you exactly what's happening in this article in a way that I never could. But I am going to read my summary because that's the point of this project. So there's a need for pedagogies in all classrooms that are student-centered and not based on the United States like white entitled definitions of words, especially those such as justice, rights, democracy, and progress. We need to be pushing for more inclusive transnational classrooms that are respective of all cultures, yet safe environments to talk about these kind of words and thoughts. So jumping straight into the TWSA project, because I was super amazed with what happened. So the aim of the TWSA project came from the need to respond to the pedagogical needs both Hosheloff and Parks faced. So how to create a classroom which would enable a more expansive, nuanced sense of civil and civic society as the basis for public engagement and activism. So pretty much what TWSA means is that it's a barn raising. It's the act of a community coming together to build a material structure. Well, in this sense, it's more of a digital structure. So it's a digital structure for students to talk about their civic society through engagement and potentially activism. So on the U.S. side, Parks openly admitted that the initial collaboration was decidedly ad hoc. The project was initially supposed to pair Parks' classroom with the local refugee resettlement project and another international partner from a different MENA country. However, before the class even began, the MENA partner withdrew her interest, and Hosheloff stepped in. So Hosheloff believed that the classroom offered a site for sustained support of bordered conceptions of civil and civic society. His courses aim to provide students with a different perspective of reactionary pedagogies that have prevailed within education. These classes are understood to be like micro versions of the larger society where teacher and students inhabit their personal, political, and indigenous identities. They get to be themselves in the classroom. So he also was able to create this space where teachers could be challenged. He called it the English Club, and he created it so that students had a space to discuss and debate outside of the mandated curriculum. As a teacher, I know that some of my best teaching days are the days that are never put into my curriculum. So while many argue that his methods were wrong because teachers and students could not share power and still have an effective classroom environment, I think that's totally wrong. Look at pretty much any grad class. We are sharing, as students, we are sharing power with our teachers to build that connection and build that information between the two of us. So the initial expected outcomes of the project was not what is now called the TWSA project. Parks and Hosheloff wanted their students to be able to have open conversations about human rights, and most often the students connected through the trauma they felt inflicted by the government. So this trauma that all citizens should be protected from is a reoccurring theme that we've been talking about, and that's our inherent westernized whiteness. So we put this whitewash on words such as democracy and rights and justice and progress without thinking about the characteristics of the country that we are now whitewashing these definitions. So it's something that we've been talking about for a while. Now the actual outcomes of the project became what is known as the TWSA project. So the project serves as a purpose for students who see trauma invoked as a way to mask a political complexity which must be articulated, addressed, and resolved. So Park and Hosheloff gave their students an agency in which to move beyond that traumatic response. So students have been gifted the power of a space to think through how their identity is being constructed, positioned, and actualized in the current moment. And this begins the process of allowing that other conversation to begin. So I have 3 quotes that really stuck out to me. The first 2 are fairly long, but this first one I wanted to pull out the fact that when you situate words such as democracy, rights, justice, progress within a historical context, they expose an underbelly premised on the colonialism's drive to define the world within the singular framework. We know that this doesn't work. So according to the singular framework, 2/3 of the world were seen as essentially lacking the rhetorical, intellectual, or political skills to successfully integrate themselves into what is defined as that singular unified concept of progress. So, and that's the United States version of democracy supportive of global capitalism. Again, you can't It just doesn't work. So the next quote, again, fairly long, but what Parks and Hoshaloff suggests is that as the field moves towards a sense of itself and its classrooms as transnational, there is a consequent danger of encoding the colonialist models of rights and democracy into our students. These models were initially used to steal land and resources from existing societies, as well as to invoke the nation-state models that allow the elitist of the society to retain and gain their power over the needs of like the mass population. And that is something that we want to get away from, especially in a transnational classroom where everyone is equal. And last, I feel this in my soul so deeply. One of the students from Algeria simply put, society will find a problem with an outspoken woman. We see this in 2019 in the United States, where even women are supposed to be equal, and they're not. So I felt this in my soul, and it was a quote that just really, really stuck out to me. So these are my sources. Google, because we love the Google. I did Google Translate to a second because I wanted to know more about that, and it pulled up quite a lot of information, and of course, of rights without guarantees. And then this last quote, if democracy is a contact sport, we act with understanding that any education in activism also has to be an education in safety. If you are going to teach activism in a classroom, you have to put in those safety nets so that everybody's voice is heard, but nobody's voice is run over. Everybody has their opinions, and in a democracy where everybody's equal and everybody has their own voice, we need to put those safety nets in and teach our own students how to put those safety nets in so that they can see others' opinions, appreciate others' opinions, but realize that they don't have to agree with those opinions.
So one of the things I really like about this article is that Steve Parks would probably not call his work transnational feminism, but having worked with him, I would absolutely call him a feminist in any way that I've worked with him, right? But he would never name that for himself because he'd be like, I don't know if I should, or, you know. But the work that he's doing, he's making it clear that just because you call something transnational doesn't make it good, right? It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it perfect. What he's saying is that too can create problems if we do what Hesford and Shell say and do that comparatist rhetoric, right? Like if we do the same thing in the US and then just call it transnational because we're going to Algeria and we're doing the same thing, but we don't take into account that in Algeria, if a student says like, our country is run by an evil dictator, like you can kind of get away with that in America as a student. Like no one's going to come up and like do something to you, most likely. The government, maybe. The government in Algeria will find you if you say that. The government will look at the words that they use. They will see if you wrote the word dictator. Like it's a very real material issue and worry that what students write, and this is something that Steve talked about, that what students write in one country is not going to be the same things that students can write in another context, right? And so that idea of transnationalism, if you're still operating under like US logic, it's not doing the thing that Hesford and Shell are asking us to, of not compare these places, but how do they operate in between those spaces? How do they operate when we think about it, you know, in Algeria or in America? What else stands out to you about Parks and H.A.Liff's article?
We were just saying, it reminded me of that communism article that I did a presentation on, the very technology that allowed No to protest the government in the country he came from, he would not have had access to. Had he stayed in the country, he would have protested. His activism couldn't exist as it does over here. So it's not, maybe not so much changing the message, but the delivery method for it.
Right.
For sure.
And an article, I think what I'm hoping that you all get out of this class is, I don't care if you know how to define neoliberalism or if you know what transnational rhetorical analysis is by definition. But what I do care about is, can you think about that moment And can you tell me why it's important to think about like how that happens? Like why Noah can be in one country and not have the same access or ability to do something as that movement across borders, and what it allows for in a different space. And like think through like, why do we have to think about this across spaces? That's what I'm hoping you get out of this class, is thinking about what structures allow some people to do things in some places and not in others, or change. That's what I'm hoping that this class is about. Those kind of in-between moments where we're looking at what's happening in those spaces that forces someone to change what they have access to or what they do. So really quickly, I want to talk about this English club, right? On page 99, they talk about an English club. And it says, when Hichilef visited Parks's advanced writing class at Syracuse University, Donald Trump had been president-elect for approximately 8 weeks. In the class period immediately after Trump's election, a somber air of trauma and fear seemed dominant. In a course that had been focused on social movements from Students for Democratic Society to Black Lives Matter, the fact of President Trump seemed to have taken the wind out of our discussions, leaving many rudderless as they looked ahead. Hichilef's visit then, focusing on the radical nature of sponsoring English clubs in Algeria, at first seemed out of place, too moderate, not speaking to the U.S. current context. It was only in the weeks following that Hichilef's argument about creating alternative spaces for democratic practices and values gained increased relevance, particularly as proposed travel bans and ICE actions swept across the nation. Whereas Parks' students wondered would be the safe spaces through which democratic dialogues could be fostered, expanded on, and eventually acted upon in the public sphere. So it's this moment where in one country, like if I said, I'm going to create an English club for my students, that doesn't seem like this act of social justice and activism and whatever, right? It's just an English club. Any one of us can create it if we're English teachers, pretty much, right? But what this article is talking about is the difference between what an English club means here and what it can do in a different country, specifically under a different political climate, different questions of what activism, who's allowed to be activists, and what education is, right? It's very kind of progressive for Ahmed to do some of the things that he's doing. And he could be fired for it. Very simply, he could be fired for it. And he knows that, and he talks openly about it.
I think putting him struggling to put his work like a concise title for his series, I think that putting that into perspective for that first section here kind of brings it all together, like the radical nature of what he's doing.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's a bad thing, just it's bold in his area, in his demographic.
Absolutely. And actually, what you're saying makes me think of a discussion I had with my mother a couple weeks ago, and we actually had a really good discussion because I asked my mom what she thought of the term activist. And she was very like reserved about it, and she kind of said, oh, I don't know if I like that term. It seems like, and she was kind of framing it as really negative, and I said, but what don't you like about the word activist? And I realized, and we talked about this if you were in my summer class, I think we had a couple moments of this where people talked about hashtag activism, and this idea where even a word, like there's nothing bad with the word activist whatsoever. It's just a word. But the way that people take up activism in certain ways can be negative or positive or everything in between on that spectrum, depending on what you want, right? But that idea of like this word has created a connotation, or like the media has created a connotation with it, that's what he's responding to in those moments of, if he says the word activist, who are the school leaders and how are they going to read that term activist? If he says social justice, again, who are the leaders and how are they reading it? I'll give you another, for instance. couple months ago, we were offering a job, and we asked for a research agenda because that's a very typical genre document. We had very right-wing groups email the university and ask us why we are talking about agendas, thinking that they were a political agenda. We're like, it's a research agenda, right? And again, so in that sense, a certain group of people took that word to be a certain way that was against what they wanted, right? And that happens on every sense of the spectrum. That words have connotations for different groups of people and how they're used, and they come with those connotations. So I think that's what, I really love about this piece, is it gets you to think, like, if a student in America uses the word dictator, how would that be taken up by an Algerian student who uses the word dictator, or, go further, and a Syrian student who uses the word dictator, or a Russian student who uses the word dictator, right? Like, how are those words taken up in different contexts, and what are the implications for that?
In this article, the establishing like a safe space, that itself is a very recently loaded term because it's been portrayed as like a refuge for people who want to shut out a certain type of thought, right? When this is back a bit, that Milo something, I forget his name, was being disinvited from talks at colleges because of real things that he had said on videos and records. It was like provable, like this is what he talks about. It suddenly turned into, oh, they want to take all the debate out of colleges, and they want to make a space so you can't have the type of intellectual conversation you're supposed to have. But they uninvited that guy from the CPAC that same year, and they didn't see the hypocrisy in doing the exact same thing. So for me, when I see that recently, I'm like, oh, this is a phrase we're not supposed to say anymore because it's become a political safe space is now a thing.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. But yes, just even how like those phrases get taken up, right?
And in 5 years, it won't mean anything to anybody anymore. It'll go back to being
Yeah.
Or it could be forever changed.
Well, and that's what language does, is that it moves across borders, right? That's, part of what we see happening, and like the words today that we kind of like stop at or think we're struggling with, or like there's tension with, could be completely different in 5-10 years. Other comments on this article? They talk a little bit about decolonialism. Can anyone think of a moment in the past, 2 weeks, that is a very kind of real instance of decolonialism trying to happen? What holiday was just celebrated? I'm glad you said that. All right. So Columbus Day. What is the other holiday being celebrated? Indigenous Peoples Day.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that's a moment in the past couple of weeks. Another conversation I had with my mother. I asked her feelings about it. And we got in a really good discussion. So thinking about what does it mean to decolonize or decolonialize a holiday? What does it mean to decolonialize a word, right? So we name it Columbus Day. Christopher Columbus, comes here. But what does it mean for some groups of people to then call it Indigenous Peoples Day? Like, what's going on in that distinction?
So it recognizes the people that were affected by the colonization instead of the colonizer.
Mm-hmm.
I had a similar conversation with my mom about that.
What?
She didn't understand why was the big thing? What's the big deal? And my sister even, she's a little bit older than me. But I just said the quick, guys, he's the bad guy. He's the conquistador. He's similar to a conquistador. Like, he's the bad guy. He came over and killed millions of us, like, just because we're Native American. Like, come on, just think about it. Why would we celebrate him? But his Columbus Day, normally lands on my birthday. So it's like, thanks.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. But yeah, so like thinking of which histories we privilege, right? And which versions of history we privilege. I will say, I really love my mom. I think everyone loves my mom. I'm like, she's one of those people like talking to. She has interesting perspectives on things. And she said to me, I get what you're saying about Indigenous Peoples Day. She goes, but I think about, like the Confederate memorial statues too. And she said, I don't want them to get rid of the statues, not because I think they're good statues, but because what if we get rid of those and people don't remember that horrible history? Like, we need to also learn that history. And I said, yeah, but you don't need to privilege the bad people, right? And so we had this discussion of I don't have an answer for this, but how do you acknowledge the history, the factual history, like what actually happened and the people who were marginalized because of that history? But how do you also be attentive to like the history that was told in a way that I think it's important to know there were these statues. There were days where we celebrated Christopher Columbus and his statue is in cities, and that's also an important history to know, because if we forget about that and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we celebrate all these the right things, we kind of forget the negative part of the history, right? I don't have an answer to that, but I'm curious of your all's opinion. So if you're thinking about this class, and we could have a class where all I do is teach like all the versions of transnationalism, and we never talk about white language supremacy and white language ideology, but what would that do to like your experience?
I personally like the memes, and just because like my students saw the memes, and that raised questions for them. Otherwise, I don't think they would have even thought about it. But I pulled up the one that said, I assume that a Columbus Day sale means I can just walk into a store and pick whatever I want. And they were like, what does that mean? And so just like doing little things like that opens up that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It creates a dialogue, right?
I'm not part of the class, but it was funny because my third grader, he, came home from school and it was Columbus Day. And they actually went to school on Columbus Day, so they learned all about him. I was like, I want to show you, we're going to watch The Addams Family. This is the second one. And it's when Wednesday and her brother have to go to this camp and they celebrate Thanksgiving. I was like, this is what happened. And, they did their alternate view of what the Thanksgiving dinner should have been like. And it was the Native Americans, kicking their ass, roping them up, setting them on fire. I mean, it was hilarious because, we won't break bread with you because, hundreds of years from now, we're going to be a people that are stuck on reservations and, because of everything that you've done to us. I was like, that's what they did, honey. That's what happened for real. But I don't know, it's just, and he's third grade. I don't know, it was a little intense, but I was like, that's the true story of what actually happened, to just people that were already here.
Yeah.
Quite entertaining, and he got it.
No, that's great. I mean, I think it's really particularly interesting when sometimes I ask my first year English class, first year writing, and I say, why do we speak English? And a lot of times, someone in the class will say, well, we've always spoken English. And, and sometimes people talk about Christopher Columbus, and I go, Christopher Columbus was not American and he did not speak English, right? And so this idea of how language supremacy gets perpetuated in these myths of who our country is founded by. And if we went back to what languages were here first or what languages we were colonized by, English isn't even one of the first 40 because you have so many before that with native languages, but then also French and Italian and all German and all these other ones first, right? So just thinking about those histories.
To address the monument thing, my issue with it is not, if you have a statue of Christopher Columbus, it's not an accurate representation of what Christopher Columbus did.
Mhm.
Same with Confederate monuments are not an accurate representation
Right.
of what went down there. It's allowing people to perpetuate different realities
Yeah.
about the same event.
Mhm.
So that, I'm not saying forget it, I'm saying use the monument to reflect the reality. What?
Remember it right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
You'd agree with you would agree with my mother. That's what. That's why she was saying. She's like, we need to teach from the monuments. We need to teach that history
But
to
the
explain,
lesson
like,
they're telling,
yeah.
and we, they came up, they were increased in the 60s and stuff. They were not historical. They're
Yeah.
not. They're for a very different purpose.
So what you're saying is the monuments should have blood on his hands.
Yes, absolutely. If you want to keep it, that's how you have it. Absolutely. Is what I would do, given all power over all monuments. That's how you wake up tomorrow, and that's how they'd be.
Yeah,
All of it.
Well, there's one in my town, so let's start there.
Okay.
In Farmersville, it's granite. It's about 20 feet tall.
Just need a can of red paint. That's not.
So we're running out of time, but I'm gonna just show you. I'm not gonna play this, but I want to show you one moment from KJ Rawson, 30 seconds. So, and we'll come back to this next week. I'm not going to assign any extra reading, but I think our discussion today, and particularly this, why I brought up the monuments, is connected to KJ Rawson, his article, but then also this other article that I'm linking. It's a cool video article. And I want us to listen to like 3 sentences.
And we should strive to include foreign digital materials in our repertoire of historical artifacts. My focus throughout this essay is on online transgender history, which I am framing here as a type of case study. The implicit argument that motivates this approach is that accounts of transgender lives and experiences cannot only be found in traditional archives and in non-digital spaces. As many scholars have noted, the archive is primarily a mechanism of power. Ashiel Mbembe summarizes this point very usefully when he writes, quote, "The archive is primarily the product of a judgment, the result of the exercise of a specific power and authority, which involves placing certain documents in an archive at the same time as others are discarded. The archive, therefore, is fundamentally a matter of discrimination and of selection, which, in the end, results in the granting of a privileged status to certain written documents and the refusal of that same status to others, thereby judging. The archive is, therefore, not a piece of data, but a status."
All right, so I want to end with this because I think it goes to our discussion of monuments. If you substitute monument or archive being a monument or a piece of paper or, whoever represent, the archive or a monument is primarily the product of a judgment, the result of an exercise of a specific power and authority, which involves placing certain documents or monuments or textbooks in an archive at the same time that others are discarded. So at the same time you privilege some voices, you get rid of others, right? The archive or your textbook or your monument is therefore fundamentally a matter of discrimination and of selection, which in the end results in the granting of a privileged status to certain people or written documents or monuments and refusal of that same status to others, thereby judged unarchivable or unpreservable, all that. The archive is therefore not a piece of data, but a status. So I want to end with that so we can kind of come back to it. Next class, pick up this discussion of what that means for like which bodies are deemed archivable and which bodies we privilege, which histories we privilege. We have no extra reading for next week. I probably will send some discussion questions ahead of time so that you know what texts I want to cover. But we're also going to get ready for the following week, which I'm actually having you read an article that I wrote in order to frame archival documents that I'm going to have you read as well. And these are archival documents written by working class people, many of whom are immigrants, many of whom are using multiple languages, or at least multiple dialects. So it's meant to be an example of a transnational project and what that looks like. Again, that's for the week after the 30th. What I'm going to do most of class next time is we're actually going to do some workshopping on your proposals and spend some time in class where you're writing and doing some writing prompts. And then it'll probably be a shorter class. And then you'll leave with actually some writing and ideas about your symposium. Questions, comments, concerns? All right. Have a good rest of the week.